In the year 2002, the game developer Dims would jump to the PlayStation 2 market with the huge popularity it was receiving. In America, on December 4th of that same year, they would bring us a mythical game full of history, Dragon Ball Z Budokai. As I promised you last week, we will talk about the Budokai saga in its entirety, the one that gave rise to many other Dragon Ball games that would be launched in the decade of the 2000s, since the Tenkaichi saga was very well received. So without further ado, let's begin. Dragon Ball Z Budokai was initially released for the PlayStation 2 console, but about a year later it had a re-release on the Nintendo GameCube. Remember, we are using the official release dates here in America. This was December 4th, 2002. For those who had the opportunity to play the existing Dragon Ball games at that time, know we came from the final bout on PS1, which looked promising, but finally its gameplay can be translated as a wave of fan service but not adequate mechanics for a fighting game or even an arcade game at that time. Therefore, the eyes of many fans of the franchise were dazzled when seeing for the first time the opening of what promised to be Budokai, first Dragon Ball game to come to PlayStation 2. Practically an identical case of what was the opening of the anime but recreated in the game engine. It is exactly the same. The fidelity was 10 out of 10, and with this, the primary intention of the game was understood to represent the story. In the year 2002, little was seen of a narrative intention of a video game based on an anime or manga, so with this first attempt, something very attractive was achieved. If the Dragon Ball story in a video game was not something that attracted young people at that time, I don't know what could. This way, Budokai was released. As always, we will go to the in-depth story section. The art of the game itself, at least as regards the main menu, is pretty close to the illustrations in the manga. However, from the moment we enter that anticipated story mode, everything is in its entirety 3D illustrations of the characters, moving in an incredibly innovative way for their time. Even I keep watching it now and I honestly think it looks damn good, and I don't know what kinds of resources were used at this time to recreate such excellent animations and cinematics on PS2. Now I can't even imagine what the fans felt when they first saw this.
Holy shit!
Well, when starting this story mode, as usual, we begin with the fight against Raditz. After a few exchanges of dialogues, the first encounter begins, and this time the game does bother to explain the controls. They know this is an aspect which many players would be eager to test at this time, so I think it's fair to at least tell them how to hit and block. It can also be considered something obvious, since it is a secret to nobody that the bases were formed here for the combat system that would be used to a greater extent for all the next deliveries that this saga would bring. Nobody knew at the time or had any idea of how the game worked, so there we have a positive point. We will continue talking about the gameplay later. For now, let's continue with what the main story offers. In addition to the cinematics included in the game are constant and very well achieved, there is also a little minigame inside the encounters of the story that help a lot to give new ways for the players to move forward. Those little dynamics where we have to support Raditz while Piccolo charges his final attack are very satisfactory things and well received by the true fans of the franchise. And well, that is the only minigame that exists in the entire story mode. It's a shame. I have been waiting for the start of some other minigames of this kind, but it seems it gave them the syndrome of starting out with many ideas and then having to cut them due to production value decisions. However, we cannot complain about the quality of the story mode that they delivered in terms of cinematics. Sorry, I'm going to be praising this aspect of the game too much during the video. And although the animations look a little cringe to some of us by now, and it is a game engine that exploited its capacity to the maximum to give that sensation of natural movement to the characters, and I love it. It is noticed from afar that this was one of the first attempts to make exactly the series of Dragon Ball Z, the video game. The fidelity is printed in every second, and they even give you previews of what will happen in the next saga as it happened at the end of each chapter in the show. Something that would have helped me a lot to feel even more in accordance with the story would have been the Japanese dubbing. Unfortunately for me, on this occasion it was impossible to play it in the original language, but I can say that the English dubbing was pretty decent. The version of the game in Europe does have the original dubbing in Japanese, so there's not much to do. After each combat, the characters unlock special abilities. Some are unique to some fighters and others are from a repertory of specific movements. In addition to that, I like the training scenarios that they provide despite they only be recycled material. Most of all, because they are all accompanied by these cinematics, but again, it is something that was only used once with Goku's training in increased gravity. At some point in the story, I came to think that the game was skipping some events that would not be considered very relevant to the development of the plot, like Vegeta's fight with Sauron, Vegeta against 18, among others. But it turns out that when you finish the story mode after the credits, you realize that some important chapters must be unlocked and they do not appear at the first time, giving an opportunity to play those fights that perhaps were missing. In addition to this, there is also a special episode that tells the events of the Soul Saga but from the point of view of Hercule, which seemed to me something very ingenious and enjoyable. To culminate this section of the story mode, I want to highlight two little things. One very good and another one a little strange. I think that the soundtrack of the final battle against Cell fits in a great way with the mood of the moment. You could even get excited.
Yes. Yes!
And finally, it was strange to me that the last perfect form of Cell was represented as that muscular Cell and out of control when he realizes that he is helpless against Gohan. Version of the character which I have never seen in any other game, by the way. But generally speaking of what the story mode achieved to cover, since it only takes us up to the Cell Saga, it offered very good ways to bring a Dragon Ball story into the video game. A medium that offers many possibilities to tell a story, but at this moment resources were more limited. Even so, the result is very good for me. When we talk about the gameplay, it is a different subject, not because I think the gameplay is bad, but it goes much beyond. Let's put us in context. In the year 2002, Dragon Ball fighting games were just making their leap to mainstream consoles. The combat system that Budokai implemented in its outing was well structured, and in part, they managed to include movements and special techniques from the Dragon Ball universe so that they fit perfectly with this gameplay concept. The 2D perspective combat was executed in a very acceptable way. It felt a faster pace that we were used to, and we liked that a lot. We had the possibility of transforming ourselves in the middle of the combat, something that was highly demanded in the previous title, and we could even go back to a basic state if we received a critical hit. The movements of the characters were a little different, even though the controls are the same for all fighters. So even though it was a good fighting style implementation at this time, I feel right now that when I replayed it for this review, the gameplay feels a little limited in mobility ways, plus the controls are not very friendly. Interesting fact, this is considered by most players the most difficult game of the entire original trilogy. Special attacks are executed after performing a specific combo. You could only throw one burst of energy, and some actions required an uncomfortable number of buttons at the same time, which was not the most practical with a PS2 or GameCube controller. It is very complicated to get used to the game style of this first Budokai. We had some additional game modes like the free fights, obviously, and the martial arts tournament that could give you extra rewards, the characters you unlocked, or money to get improvement. The cast of characters are 23 in its entirety. Understandable because you only get to the Soul Saga. Characters like Adult Gohan, Goten, Little Trunks, Majin Buu, Kid Buu, Kaioshin, among others were missing. And it is the first Dragon Ball game that existed on PS2, so its capacity was more limited. The scenarios were not many either, but the selection menu of them is surprisingly well done, with the characteristic animations of each combat arena, little details that I have not seen again in the future, honestly. and the martial arts tournament that could give you extra rewards. In conclusion, this game became one of the best sellers of the entire platform, and for a fair reason. Even when its respective sequels came out and some different titles also arrived, this game continued to be superior in terms of narrative and cinematics. It is very good. Its gameplay evolved and brought with it new ways of playing to make it feel more organic and easier to handle. Here in the first installment, the frame data needs a little more adjustment, but otherwise it feels like a Dragon Ball game that delivers for everything else. In this way, the players like you and me can continue to appreciate everything it did for the genre, being the first game to lead to the golden age of Dragon Ball games. Special editions such as the Budokai HD collection allow new players to experience what was the beginning of Dragon Ball games in the 2000s, and it will always be a pleasure to bring you all of what these mythical games had to offer. As always, I will be watching your comments about this game and what was your experience with it. And if you could not play it, tell me what you think of the video and if it gave you an idea of what the game was like. I will be glad to read them. Thank you so much for watching the video until the end, and that was all for today. Take care and see ya!